a new sequence over here. So I'm going to come here and go to my design ribbon, click new, and say new sequence. And I'm going to call this, let's call it the addition sequence. So what this addition sequence is going to do is it's going to add two numbers together, or two arguments together. So I'll click create. So note we have our main sequence and we have our addition sequence. The purpose and function of an argument is to pass values between different workflows. All right, so directly in UiPath Studio, that's how you would use arguments, but arguments can also be used to pass data into other systems using APIs, or you can use arguments within your UiPath it's called again, UiPath Assistant, hit a blank for a second. So when you're using your UiPath Assistant, you can also pass arguments directly from here. Okay, so let me just demonstrate how to actually use these. So I'm going to create an argument, and the only difference between arguments and variables is they now have a direction. Right, variables don't have directions, arguments do. So let's call this first one. Let's say, I'm going to say value 1, but the notation, best practice is to write in underscore value 1. Right, when you're writing arguments, you want to put in underscore if it's set to the in direction. Then argument 2, I'm going to say in underscore value 2. I'll also keep it to the in direction. The argument type, since we're dealing with numbers, because it's an addition sequence, we want to change this to an integer, okay, for both of them. And the reason we're changing it to an integer is because we want to perform mathematical operations on these arguments. If it's set to a string, you can't perform mathematical operations on it. Only when it's an integer or a double, you are able to actually perform mathematical operations like plus, minus, multiply, etc. Lastly, we have create. We want to create a result of the two. So let's say out some results, something like that. And then the direction, we must change it from in to out, and also set this to an integer. Okay, note in the direction here, there's 4 different options. In will mean you can only pass this value into this workflow, okay? And I'll show you exactly how to do that in just a moment. Out means you can only pass that value or this argument out of this workflow. In-out means it allows the functionality to do both. You can pass that argument both into this workflow and you can pass it out. Then lastly, we have property, and this just simply disables this property, disables this argument. So let's just leave this to property for now. I'm going to come to the main sequence, and I'm going to then search for an activity called invoke workflow file. There it is. So I'm going to drag in the invoke workflow file, and what this activity does is this will basically run another one of your workflows within your main sequence. So you can select the path, and you can see I currently don't have any arguments. It's saying 0. I'm going to come here, browse, and I'm going to select my addition sequence, and I'll press open. Okay. And now if I come here to import arguments, it's still not showing me my arguments, even though we did just create them. So just a little trick you need to know is you actually need to save your workflow before that. So you can see there's a little asterisk there, and over there it means these files still need to be saved. So if I come here, save all, you'll see now this little square here changed from blue to orange. If I click import arguments, you can see I'm able to see my in value 1 and my in value 2. But note, we're not able to see our out sum result over here. And the reason we can't see that is because we set the direction to property, which basically disabled it. And that's why we're not able to see it here. So if you want to be able to use that property, then we can come here to addition sequence, change our direction to out, come back to main. Note it's still not going to be here because we actually have to save it. So I'll come here, save all, go to import arguments, and now you can see we have our out sum result arguments. Okay, so now that we have these, we can now pass values from this main workflow into our addition sequence. And then we can pass the result back into main. So before we do that, I'm just going to come to addition sequence, and I'm just going to do the actual calculation. I'll drag in an assign, and I will say our out sum result must be equal to the in value 1 plus in value 2. There you go. So that should be good enough to do the calculation. Then back in our main, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to our import arguments, and here by our out sum result, I'm going to create a new variable that's going to be stored in our main flow. So I'll click Control K, and I'll call it sum result. Right, notice I don't have the direction because this is now a variable inside our main sequence. I'll click OK. If I come to my variables panel, you'll see I now have our sum result, which is an integer in our sequence scope. Okay, so let me just drag in a message box so we can test this, or drag and drop that below the invoke workflow. And in this message box, I'm going to display a sum result. You might be tempted to write a .to string here to convert this integer into a string, but you actually don't have to do that. And the reason for that is with a message box, if you go to the property, you'll see that it's of type object. It's not of type string. If you're using a write line activity, it's of type string, so you'll need to do .to string. But because we're using a message box, it's an object which accepts most data types like strings, integers, booleans, doubles, date time, etc. So then you don't need to convert it. It will already know. So I'll click there. Next thing I'm going to do is come and run this main file. Let's see what happens. All right, so we get our message box, and you can see we get an answer of 0. And the reason we get an answer of 0 is because we didn't add any numbers for our values for our first and second values. So I'll click OK. So let's go do that quickly. Under import arguments, I'm going to come into, let's say, the number 5 for value 1 and the number 3 for value 2. So we know 5 plus 3 should equal 8. So I'll click OK. Let's run this. And the message box is just going to pop up probably on my other screen. And I'll just drag it in. And we can see there is the result, number 8. So that worked just as we wanted it to. So just as a reminder of how this works, we're running the main workflow. It starts with a sequence, then it runs the invoke workflow. And what this does, this then runs the addition sequence, because that's what we have set here, addition sequence.xaml. It brings us here. And inside here, we pass the values into this workflow using these two arguments, in value 1, in value 2, which we passed over here from our main sequence. And then when it passed it in here, then we used those values over there. We got our result with our out sum result, assigned that to our out argument. That then got passed back into the main sequence over here with our out sum result, stored that in a variable called sum result, and then displayed our sum result in a message box. So if you're a beginner, that would be quite confusing, but once you do some practice activities where you just try set this up, a simple example like this, get an understanding exactly what the in and out means, then it should become a lot easier. Okay, let's see if we have any questions. Why can't I put the values in the default value under arguments in the addition sequence workflow instead of the main? Okay, so you can do that. You can come here to your addition sequence and you can enter the values here like 5 and 3. All right, you can do that. However, the main benefit of using arguments is to actually pass values from this main workflow. So let's say maybe the default values are always, say, 0 and 0. We can do something like that and keep the default there. But then whatever values you have set here inside your main will then get passed into your addition workflow. So you can do it this way. One thing to note is you can't have a default value for an output argument. So the out sum result, you'll see it says default value not supported. But there is some cases where you still want to have a default value for your out sum result. So what you can do in that case, you can simply just use like an assign, and then you can say assign your out sum result, and then you can give a value. Let's say you want the out sum result to always be 0 as the default. So if you have it like this, then out sum result will also have a default value. That's the only way you can actually set a default for an out direction argument. Right, other questions? All right, looks like that's the only questions on arguments. Mail messages. So you can use the output of the mail message to use email attributes like the body, the subject line, the sender email address, etc. The only activity of these 5 which don't require a password is the Outlook activity. All right, this one over here. And so as long as you have Outlook installed on your machine and you're signed in on your Windows PC, it will automatically connect to that inbox. Right, so if you're using the get exchange mail message, the get IBM notes, get IMAP, and get POP3, those require both the email address and the password to log into that email address in order to use it. Whereas if you're using the get Outlook mail message, then you don't need to provide a password. So that's just something you need to know. Okay, retry scope. Okay, so retry scope, this one's a little bit tricky to try understand, but that's what we're going to cover now. I'm going to explain to you exactly what this is. Before I continue, I see we have a question. Under the invoke workflow, I do not put any numbers in the default, but I leave the values in the default value in the arguments in the addition sequence. The answer is 0. Why is it not the sum of the default values in addition? Under invoke, I do not put any numbers in the default value. I see what you're saying. So you're basically saying, let me just share my screen, let's demo this. You do not have, you have values there, but then in your invoke workflow, you don't provide any values over here. Okay. And then you run this, and you say the answer is 0. Let's run that. I think you're right. Let's just check. Yeah, there you go. You get 0. So you are right about that. So what actually happens in this case is when you running this invoke workflow, it's pulling values. What's going on here? Why is it saying 10 and 6 here? Just delete that. Oh, it's pulling in the default values. Okay. It just keeps pulling in the default values. That's strange. Let me just run this. And then you get 16. Okay, I think what happens is it's only on the first run. I think it's because I think that's just a bit of a bug. What's happening is it's remembering that these two fields were blank before, so then it takes those values as zeros. But usually when you put in values into your default values over here, it should automatically pull through into your invoke workflow file like it did here. You probably just needed to maybe save all before you try and run it just to pull in these values. So I think that's what happened there. I think it's just a little bit of a bug. But yeah, Cool. And it requires both an action and a condition. Okay. Now, this will retry the contained activities as long as the condition is not met or an error is thrown. So what that basically means is the retry scope will retry whatever you have here in this section, all right? Above the condition, we have this section over here, which will, it'll attempt that while this condition is not met, or if an error is thrown over here. Okay, so it's best to demonstrate this with an example. So we will do an example, but basically let's assume that all our timeouts are set to their defaults, and we are using a calculator app and we're trying to click on the number 7. Okay, so this is what will happen. It will try to, we have a click activity here, so it'll try to click the button number 7, and it'll take 30 seconds to try and identify this user element on the screen. If no UI element is found, it will then run into an error within the scope. Okay, so it'll run into an error within this retry scope, so it won't break your entire bot. And it will then wait 5 seconds. And the reason it's 5 seconds is because here under retry interval, we have it set to 5 seconds. So it's then going to wait 5 seconds. After 5 seconds, it will then retry this click action, and it'll try click the 7 again for another 30 seconds. And this will be retried another 2 times after that if errors keep coming up. Then the entire workflow will run into an error. The reason it tries it another 2 times is because here under number of retries, we set that value to 3, which means this action gets retried a total of 3 times. If you set that to 4, this will get retried 4 times. Okay, so now let's say, for instance, the button 7, right, becomes available on the screen. Okay, so let's say we now open the calculator application while the bot's running. It will then identify the user element. Okay, it will then click the number 7, and then after that, right, then it checks for the condition. So the scope then checks if the element exists condition is true, so it'll check this for 30 seconds. If element exists is false, it will then retry. If true, then the loop will end successfully. Because remember, I mentioned it retries the contained activities as long as the condition is not met. So if this is false, meaning the condition is not met, then an error is thrown. But don't worry, I will demonstrate this to you to explain it more clearly. The other important thing to know is that in the condition, you can only use 2 activities. You can either use the element exists, or you can use the image exists activity. So those are the only 2 activities that the retry scope allows as input. It's the element exists, which looks for a user interface element on the screen, and an image exists, which checks for an actual image, little graphic that you select. It waits for that image to show up on the screen. So those are the 2 activities that work with the condition. Okay. In terms of the properties of the retry scope, okay, we have the number of retries. So that's the number of times the sequence is to be retried. We have retry interval, which specifies the amount of time between each retry. And then we have the continue on error. So this specifies if the automation should continue even when the activity throws an error. So this field only supports Boolean values, true and false, and the default value is false. So if it's blank, it means it's false. And as a result, if the field is blank and an error is thrown, the execution of the project stops. If the value is set to true, the execution of the project continues regardless of any errors. And that applies to all activities with continue on error property. If you set continue on error property to true, then if that activity runs into any error at all, it'll still continue to run. Whereas if you have it set to false or blank, which means false, then the entire workflow will stop and run into an error. It's very important to understand how the continue on error property works. it's very useful, especially when you start developing automations. So before we continue, let me demonstrate this retry scope to you. Everything we have in this main sequence. Also close this addition sequence. We're not using that anymore. And I'm going to search for retry scope. I'm going to drag in retry scope into here. Note if you can't find your classic activities, if you click this filter option, there should be an option here which says show classic. So the reason it's saying show modern for me is because I'm by default using the classic design. So if I check this, it'll show the modern activities. But if you are by default using the modern design, it'll have a button here saying show classic. And remember that setting is set over here, design, use modern for new projects. Mine's disabled, and that's why it's saying show modern for me over here. Okay, back to retry scope. Okay. Someone's asking, can retry scope be used with text exist? Or what other option can we use? Can we go for that does not this for text exist? So let me show you that. So we have the element exists option. Let me actually just type exists. Okay, so element exists, drop that in. Okay, and we can see the element exists result is a Boolean. Okay, then we also have an image exists, right? So you can use image exists over here. You also mentioned the output of that is also Boolean. You mentioned text exists, all right, over here. I've personally never tried it with text exists, but it should be able to work because you can see the output is Boolean. So I'm sure it does work, but not that I'm aware. Okay, so let's just, but for now, the general case is it's just element exists and image exists that work as a condition. It would be good to test that out though. So let's just quickly test this out with element exists and what else? A click activity. Drag the click into the action over here. Okay, and let me use a calculator. So I'll search for calculator. And let's say for the element exists, we want to check if this calculator application exists. So I'll click indicate on screen and I'll select with my computer vision, I'll select the entire application. Then for the click, indicate on screen, let's say we just want to click this number 5. All right. Then on the retry scope, okay, then we can set the number of retries. Let's say we want to retry 3 times. Retry interval, notice that this requires a time span input. So you can't just write 5 for 5 seconds because then it's going to do this, right? The notation is the same notation that is given in a delay. So if I come to these delay snippets, let's say we have a delay 3 seconds, all right? In this delay 3 seconds, you can see the duration is also a time span, and then that's the notation. So it's like, I believe that's hours, that's minutes, and that's seconds. So I'm just going to copy this, Control C, and I'll come here into the retry scope, and I'll paste that, and I'll change that 3 to 5 for 5 seconds. I'll press OK. I'm going to delete this sequence with the delay 3 seconds. We're not using that. And there you have it. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this calculator, okay, and I'm going to run this workflow. So let's see what happens. We kept all the values to their defaults. So now it's running. Okay, so now you can see it's now on the click button 5. You can see it's partially executed. You can even see here in our logs in the output panel, click button 5 executing. Now what's happening is it's taking that 30-second default timeout to try and identify the 5 button. But because our calculator is closed, it's not able to identify this 5. So eventually, it should run into an error within this retry scope. Okay, so I'm just going to wait a couple seconds. There you go. We see here it ran into an error. Click button 5, could not find the UI element, right? But then you can see what happened now. It's retrying to click that 5 button. And that's because we have our retry scope. We have number of retries 3, so it's busy retrying that. So it's going to keep doing that for another 30 seconds and then another 30 seconds until it runs into an error. However, if I open up the calculator app, okay, you'll see how it was able to identify the calculator or the UI element number 5, and then it clicked it. So it successfully clicked 5, and then what it did right at the end, it checked the element exists. So you can see here in the output panel, element exists executing. And then because this was true, it was able to identify this calculator application. Then it then closed, which means it finished running that, and then the whole sequence closed. So that's how that works. It will always retry this, and then only once it identifies the UI element does it check the condition. Okay. Someone also, I'm sure you actually can. Let's go OCR exist. Let's try this out while we're here. Okay. OCR exists. Okay. OCR text exists. Let's maybe just use that text exists one. Text exists. Indicate on screen.
Okay.
Let's select maybe this standard text over here. So I'll select that as a UI element. Okay. Text that we are searching for. So the string you are searching for, note all strings have to be placed between quotation marks. So let's write standard. Okay. And that should probably be all you need to test this. So for this, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to change this retry scope to maybe just 1 retry. And I'm going to change the timeout on this click 5 just so that we're not waiting 30 seconds. Let's just change it to like 3000 milliseconds, which is 3 seconds. And text exists. I'll just leave it to the default. Okay, so let's test this out. I'll open the calculator. It's available. Let's run this and see what happens. So we can see now it was able to click the 5 buttons, so that click worked. But for text exists, you can see the text exists standard is busy executing, which means it's not able to identify that standard text. And that means after 30 seconds, this text exists is going to run into an error and end the workflow. You can see there's our error. The retry scope action failed to execute. So that answers your question. You are not able to use the text exists as a condition, and the same would apply to your get OCR, your get OCR, I believe was get OCR exists, yeah, OCR text exists. That also won't work. All right, so the only ones that work is the element exists and image exists, which is this activity over here. This one would work.